Alright, what's going on, guys? I had the opportunity to get hands-on with Lies of P Overture. I got to play the game for 2 hours, going through the first level up to the first boss, which you will be seeing on screen, and then playing the game's new boss rush mode, and fighting 3 other new bosses. In that 2 hours, I managed to beat all of the content provided on the maximum difficulty provided, and I was told I was the only person to do so aside from one other earlier in the day. Now the reason I say that is because I used to absolutely suck at Lies of P, but over the last year in my free time, I've been diving back into this game on New Game Plus, and I found a newfound appreciation for it. And I will admit, pretty much all of my past grievances about the game were skill issues. Now, fortunately, with the DLC, you don't need me to tell you how good the base game is, you already know that. Overture is more of the best of Lies of P, and we have a lot of content to discuss, a lot of content coming with this DLC, and you already heard me mention a little bit of it. Boss rush, difficulties, that's just the tip of the iceberg. We have a lot to break down, but the best place to start is with what is Lies of P Overture. Lies of P Overture is of course a new DLC for the base game of Lies of P, but even without purchasing for $29.99 all the new content, there is still going to be a pretty big overhaul to the base game, which we will break down later on. But the new content of Overture is a prequel to the setting of the base game, exploring the days right before the Puppet Frenzy outbreak and delving into more secrets of the alchemists. Now, since we were only allowed to play the first level, the actual full plot of the DLC was not revealed to us, but as we've already seen with the trailer and the descriptions online, we'll be fighting alongside the fabled legendary Stalker, facing off against even more powerful enemies to unravel the dark secrets hidden in the past. Now, they say these are the final days of Beauty in Krat, but as you can clearly see, from the very beginning of this DLC, things are already twisted out of recognition. Now, Overture adds many new weapons, Legion arms, skills, items, bosses, pretty much more of everything. And I tried out quite a bit of it. I didn't get to use everything yet, but man, the stuff I did use was absolutely awesome. Those 2 hours flew by so fast, I was not ready to quit. But I got far enough to where they had to stop me, saying I reached the end of the allowed content, and let me tell you about it. The first level of Overture is Krat Zoo, a menagerie of different animals twisted by the corruption. It starts off with the player walking through this snowy forest. We didn't get to see how the player ended up here, but Jiminy does mention something about a stargazer, and putting together the context clues that Krat Zoo burned down a long time ago, he of course deduces that that stargazer transported us to the past. Now right off the bat, with the new enemies we're facing, they inflict a new status effect called Freeze, which if applied fully, drains the player's health and slows their movements. And that was an absolute pain to deal with when inflicted. You don't want to get caught by that. The build we were provided with was a balanced quality build with stats high enough to wield all of the new weapons. The one that we started with was the new Gunblade, a great sword with a cannon on it, and I had been warned pretty early on that it was a bit underpowered from people that played before me, so I opted to switch the weapon out and tried out this new massive pinwheel weapon. Now honestly, I thought it was ugly, but the moveset was pretty cool, so I kept the weapon's handle, but threw on a blade that did the most damage, and I'm not gonna lie to you guys, this thing was absolutely busted. It's called the Arch's Guardian Blade, and I combined it with the Maniac's pinwheel handle. It looks a lot like Laxasia's sword, and the skill is also very similar, as we'll talk about soon. The ability on this blade coats the player in lightning and gives you a new special dodge, while also buffing the weapon with lightning damage as well. And this was just putting out some insane numbers. That came in especially handy in the boss fight of this level, which we'll talk about later on. We also got to try out 2 of the new Legion arms, one of which was a shotgun that could be charged up, and when fully charged would one-shot most of the smaller enemies, but could also do big stagger damage to a boss. The other launched these little shurikens, and could be charged up to shoot 2 at once, and they would stay suspended in the air doing damage over time. Now I'm not gonna lie, neither one of these felt particularly strong, but perhaps we find more utility for them when we actually get to use them at an extended period in the final version of the DLC. But I opted to use the shotgun in my run. But getting back to the level itself, the zoo has you facing off against many different kinds of corrupted animals. You start off fighting these twisted mandrills, and these guys are pretty easy, they staggered with every hit of the weapon, but there are some bigger ones later on, but they're not too bad either. I will tell you what gave me the hardest time were the corrupted kangaroos. The small ones can turn into Sonic the Hedgehog and roll around in a ball, but the big kangaroos can pull off some crazy combos by hopping towards you and kicking you with their legs, and their tails have some insane reach on them. They killed me a few times. There are also mutated elephants, giraffes, wolves, among other things, but you get the idea. It's a zoo. What is cool though is that you can actually read a lot of the plaques throughout the zoo. Just a cool detail. Now, like many of the other levels in Lies of P, the actual layout itself is fairly straightforward. If you play the level like a Roomba checking every single corner, eventually the only one that will continue on is the main path, but the others will lead you to treasure chest and new loot. And of course there are shortcuts back to the main Stargazer that are not hard to find either. This is just only the opening level of the DLC. I'm sure it expands a lot later on, but as far as the Krat Zoo level goes, it's pretty standard with the early levels of the base game in terms of layout. But now let's talk about the main boss of this level. This is the Tyrannical Predator, a giant corrupted crocodile who likes to do a lot of charge attacks. He does have attacks where he can slam his jaw down and spin with his tail. The tail attack caught me quite a bit. That one was hard to see coming. He also has an attack where he'll open his mouth and charge forward, and the timing on that can be hard to pinpoint also. Now I gotta be honest, this boss was pretty easy. I managed to beat it first try. Honestly, I was doing too much damage to it to the point where I thought something was wrong. I was expecting a phase 2. Hopefully I have the footage of that. We were allowed to record the level portion, so hopefully you guys can see that, because the lightning buff on that weapon I was talking about came in especially handy in this fight. That special dodge was extremely useful in getting out of the way of his charges. But I do think this serves as a great introductory boss into the DLC because the other ones we got to fight were much harder. But after beating the Tyrannical Predator, it opened up into a greenhouse level where the main enemies were these feminine puppets. And these were pretty tough, but since I was using a special weapon with lightning attributes, it was able to exploit their elemental weakness, which is something to keep in mind, especially on the later boss fights. But that level itself was pretty short. I ended up pretty quickly at the next boss arena, which was for Markiona the Puppeteer of Death, who we'll talk about in a minute. However, that was when they came up to me and stopped me, telling me that was the end of the allowed content, and I still had about 15 minutes left to play around. Now what I ended up doing with that remaining time was trying out the bow, and I've got some pretty mixed feelings about it. As a primary weapon, I don't think it's very good. The range is pretty limited. You do have infinite ammo, but it doesn't seem to put out that much damage. But as a backup weapon, when you need to put some distance between yourself and the enemies, that's where the utility lies. And the big charge shot skill you have is pretty cool too. The other hour of gameplay we got was in the game's boss rush mode. Now I'll talk about the details of this mode real quick before we actually get into the bosses in case you don't want to be spoiled on what exactly those bosses are. When Overture releases, if you go to the Hotel Krat Stargazer, at the very bottom there will be a new boss rush mode. This will add the option to do individual fights as well as gauntlets with various difficulty levels ranging from 1 through 6. And when we loaded in, the default difficulty there was 3. In order to unlock difficulties 4, 5, and 6, you had to beat them on the lower levels first. And considering 3 was the one we loaded in with, that was likely the level of the base game. Now what's interesting is that we never really got a straight answer on that, because they said the difficulties themselves are not directly scaling damage and HP. There are other factors at play when changing the difficulty. Again, we didn't get any specifics on this, but that's what they said. It's not just a straight scaling factor. Now, there were 3 new bosses to choose from in that boss rush. I won't name them yet, but I did manage to beat all 3 of them on the level 3 difficulty, which again seemed to be the closest to the standard base game. We were not allowed to record this part of the playtest. And another part of it that was not open to us that they described to us were boss gauntlets, called death marches. This is where you can create your own boss rush in any order, with a minimum of 3 bosses going up to every boss in the game. And you can change the difficulty on those as well. Now, I don't know if there are going to be pre-made death marches that you can unlock special rewards by completing or not. I hope there are, but we did not learn about that in the event. Now, here's where I'm going to talk about the new bosses, so here is a spoiler warning. If you do not want to know about the new bosses that were not shown in the first level, then go ahead and skip ahead to where I talk about the new game update. But here's your warning. The first boss in the boss rush that I went up against was Markiona the Puppeteer of Death. We saw her in the trailer for Overture. She is the puppeteer who has this sort of angel puppet that fights alongside her. This was a fun fight. There's a lot that's going on trying to balance the puppet that she commands, while also fighting off against her when she uses these big blue orbs to attack. But there's a really good rhythm, because when the puppet is about to attack, the strings will glow red, and there wasn't really a moment where she was attacking with the orbs while also commanding the puppet at the same time. There was a good back and forth, so it didn't feel unfair. What makes the fight confusing though, is that oftentimes when you're fighting Markiona herself, parrying or dodging her combos with the blue orbs, the puppet will attack from off screen. So you really have to be watching the strings themselves, and as soon as they glow red, I would just hold my block. And that worked out really well. I was using the Eye of Ouroboros, and there wasn't a time when I was just blocking that her attacks broke my posture. So when the puppet would attack from off screen, I would block and then hit Marchiona and get all my health back. By not focusing on the puppet and instead treating it as a single fight against Marchiona with some off screen attacks, to me that made it a lot more manageable. Now when you get her about halfway, she will do a big attack with the puppet where it glows bright orange and does a few slam attacks and then causes a giant explosion in the middle of the arena. This causes Marchiona to go into a more aggressive state, if I remember correctly. So if you can survive that midpoint phase change, then the fight goes back to being what it was before. I was able to beat her in about 5 or 6 tries. She wasn't that hard, and as soon as you beat Marchiona, the puppet dies too, which is why I was kind of saying I just ignored the puppet and treated it as just some off-screen attacks that would occasionally come in. It was a very fun fight, and I think for the second boss in the DLC, it's a good difficulty. And out of the 3 we got to fight, it was my favorite by far. The second boss in the boss rush was the Two-Faced Overseer. This was a really big dude we fought down in some kind of alchemist laboratory, and he had some kind of jar on his head with a green liquid. Now he was much taller than the player, and wielded a big club. Now this fight was pretty straightforward. He didn't have a big moveset, but every one of his swings, if blocked and not parried, would absolutely decimate my stamina, and I'm really not that good at parrying, so I opted to primarily dodge. Now this guy also had a ton of health. His attacks were a combination of a lot of sweeps and smashes with the club, and they were pretty well telegraphed, so they weren't hard to see coming. But again, if you got hit, it would do a ton of damage. At around the quarter health mark, he would transition into this state where he's glowing red and becomes much more aggressive. And he begins this like 10-hit combo with the club where he's smashing it over and over and over again. Now if you can manage to parry those, it's an excellent way to break down his posture. But for me that sucks at parrying, I just ran away. Now since he was much faster in this state, honestly I found his normal combos to almost be easier to manage and block and dodge, because as soon as the telegraph would appear, that's when you do it. But this more aggressive state would last for again about a quarter of his health before he went back to the other, slower one. And that was kind of the gimmick of this fight. Every 25% or so he would go back and forth between these states. It doesn't change much. This was a pretty straightforward fight, but with a lot of health and doing a lot of damage, it's just a matter of not making mistakes. And I was able to bring him down in about 7 or 8 tries. But the final boss we got to fight in the boss rush was the Anguished Guardian of the Ruins, and we saw this guy a bit in the trailer for Overture. This was definitely the hardest of the 3, and there's several different reasons for that. This is one of those fights where he takes up a giant portion of the arena. If you manage to get under him, you're not going to be able to see anything, and you're kind of battling the camera alongside the boss. Now, to balance that out, the boss really only has a handful of attacks total. So after you've done your first, maybe your second try, you're going to have seen everything. It's just a matter of, like I said, actually being able to see what's happening. So the best way to approach this fight that I found was just standing right in front of his face. He can do a big fury attack where he stands up real tall and then slams down, but the timing on that was very easy to figure out. He can do an attack where he spins and then slams the ground with one of his hands. That has about 2 hits. There's another where he does a swipe with the spear and then follows up with 2 quick jabs. And then there's one where he jumps across the arena with a giant spear from above. And I'm pretty sure that's it for phase 1. In phase 2, the giant spear that he's holding above becomes imbued with this holy light, and now attacks with that spear do a giant explosion afterward. He then gains 2 new attacks where he fires a laser from his mouth, but aside from that everything remains the same. And it's just a matter of watching out for those lasers and remembering the follow-up explosion from the spear. Now despite the big size of the boss, I don't think it did as much damage as the second one, except for the lasers. The lasers absolutely decimated my health bar, but I managed to bring down this boss in about 10 to 12 tries, I think. These bosses were fun, definitely not as hard as like Lexatia or Simon Manus, or even I would say King of Puppets and the Romeo fight. If I had to give a direct comparison to difficulty, I'd say something like Green Monster of the Swamp, both phases. Now I'm not saying the whole DLC is not going to be that hard, because I doubt we've seen the best it has to offer, but while these 3 were fun fights, they were around the middle in terms of difficulty. But now that we've gone over the new content of Overture that we were allowed to look at, another thing shipping alongside the DLC is a massive quality of life update. Now, while we were not provided the details of this update in full, there were a few things that I noticed that were new. Now, whether these are unlocked in the DLC or part of the new update, I'm not sure, but there were a few new things. Firstly, when leveling up, you will have on the bottom of your screen all of your ergo chunks available to use in that menu. So you no longer have to exit and go into your inventory and then come back. It's all in one place now. There are also now 3 new difficulty modes for the base game. The first 2 are called Butterfly's Guidance and Awakened Puppet, and therefore a more casual experience, making the game easier. The default difficulty is now called Legendary Stalker. Now, if you feel some type of way about easy mode, according to them, the feedback has been extremely positive, so ultimately it will lead more players to playing the game who otherwise wouldn't. And that's just the reality of it. But the game itself has been out for a while now, so if they're gonna do it, alongside the DLC is a good choice. Now, some other things I noticed were that there were several new elements for the grindstone, doing things like critical hit damage and several other things that I hadn't seen before, but I'll be honest, in my playthrough I didn't use all of them. I got fire, lightning, and acid and didn't really touch the rest, so I'm not sure which ones are all new and which aren't, but I did notice there were quite a few new ones. Another thing is that in our playthrough we were wearing more rings than should be allowed. Either 5 or 6, again I can't remember off the top of my head right now, but there were definitely new ring slots available. And that alone right there is going to make you way more powerful. But whether that comes through a new upgrade in the quartz tree, or is just automatically unlocked when the update rolls out, we don't yet know. But those are all the changes I can remember and I had written down. There may be others you notice in the footage, and of course I don't believe the boss rush mode is tied to the DLC, so either way, if you have the base game and don't purchase the DLC, you will still have that new content to look forward to. And I'm sure this patch is going to bring a lot more. But that is pretty much everything I got to experience with Lies of P Overture. This is gonna be good. It's more Lies of P, and that's probably the best compliment I can give it, simply because the base game was already so good. Now, what we experienced was only a taste of it. There's gonna be a lot more here, especially with that $29.99 price tag. You know you're gonna have plenty of content. But y'all let me know down below, are you looking forward to Lies of P Overture? Personally, I cannot wait. I've got my new Game Plus build ready to go, but let me give a massive thank you to NeoWiz and everyone involved that provided me with this opportunity. I'm extremely grateful. But with all that, if you enjoyed today's video, be sure to leave a like on it and subscribe if you're new around here, and I will catch you in the next one.